Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the art and architecture of the early church. This is a picture of a catacomb burial lid. Notice the artwork on there is depicting the Magi who were bringing their gifts to the baby Jesus. Another example from the catacombs, and we see a number of Old Testament and New Testament themes too. This is Moses striking the rock, and it's coming forth. And of course, there's a little bit of imagery there. Notice the person who's partaking of the water is sprinkling all over them, and perhaps there's also a picture here, sort of the idea of baptism. A depiction of the three Jewish heroes in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the fiery furnace are depicted. And the catacombs, these places of burial, and remember that the Christians weren't here necessarily because they were in hiding. Instead, they were here because they thought it was appropriate and proper to give the dead, even the dead that were not their own, an honored burial. Now I want to move to Christian architecture. We see the Stoa all the way going back all the way to the Jewish temple, the Stoa as the place of meeting, a meeting place. What we're looking here as is a replica of Herod's temple, the temple that was there in the days of Jesus. On the right, you can see the temple proper standing up with the spikes around the top of the edge. Those were designed, I'm not sure if that's what they look like. They were designed to keep the birds off so that the birds would not mess all over the temple. And then you have the inner courts, and then as you move to the center of the screen, you can see the court of the women, and then that low wall that separated the areas where Jews were allowed from the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. But on the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you see the what was known as the Stoa, the Porch of Solomon. And this had become a meeting place among the Jews. It was probably also, well, we read in the book of Acts, it was the place where the church, the early church, as they outgrew anybody's private home, they would come here to meet. As the church left Jerusalem and began to go to other places, you find the church meeting in homes, but eventually, by the second century, we're going to begin seeing homes sometimes converted into churches themselves. What you're looking at here is a mock-up of a Jewish synagogue, but the churches would follow very oftentimes the same rough pattern. For example, if you go to Capernaum, you'll see what was thought to be the house of Peter, but then over top of that would be built a church. Once Peter had died and the house wasn't being used for that purpose anymore, still perhaps as a meeting place, there was built a church, and yet it had a different shape. We're going to see the octagonal shape being used for the church. Now, we have to make a distinction between the church versus the temple. A temple was a place where the God, or if we're talking about the Jewish temple, where God himself had his manifestation, his place of residence. And the church, by contrast, was a place where people came and entered and worshiped. The people were the church. So the people wouldn't go into the temple, they'd go outside the temple. Only the priests would go into the temple, whether it was a pagan temple or even the Jewish temple. But the church, people would come there and they would learn and they would sing and they would be the gathering place. They would be the church. That's what the word church means. Now, here we see an interesting example of a pagan temple. Notice the big pillars. This is the temple, if I remember correctly, to Apollos. But then right next to it, indeed sharing some of the same walls, and is a brick structure that was an early church in the city of Sardis. So you have the pagan temple, and right next to it, the church. And of course, we're not told why they put the church quite so close. Was that available land? It's because maybe the temple was going out of business, and so the church moved into a place that had been already thought by the people of Sardis to be a place of holiness, a place of the gods. But here we're going to be here to tell you about the God, the true God, not the pagan God, but the God who sent his son to die and rise again for our sins. But in any case, you do have a church there at Sardis. Still in Sardis, you go to the other side of the town and you see a synagogue. Now, this is a very ornate synagogue. Of the largest synagogues that we have found, notice the the walkway, the ground level, has very ornate mosaics engraved into the very floor. You see on either side what was called the Aron, the place where they would keep the scriptures. And then looking again more of the floor, and you can barely see it off to the right. That's the Greek gymnasium, much like the church had occupied that place right next to the pagan temple. Here the synagogue occupied a place, shared a wall with the gymnasium. And don't think gymnasium as a place of exercising, although they did that too, but it was a place that appealed to all sorts of things for the body. And so it was a place of Greek culture and paganism. And here's the synagogue sharing that same space. Again, as if to say, we're going to represent God in the midst of this very dark place. Now, I mentioned the octagonal church. By about the 4th and 5th century, you're beginning to see that shape being used sometimes for churches, sometimes for baptistries, because baptism would take place not in the meeting hall of the church, but in a connected building, a connected structure. And then you would also have a basilica. Now, the word basilica actually is related to the word for kingdom. And the idea here, this was the kingdom of God here on earth. You're looking here at the basilica at Philippi, or at least the ruins of it. Now, the other format that we see is the cruciform form. In other words, a church built in the shape of a cross. And this is going to catch on and become quite popular in church architecture. Here we see the outline of the Church of St. John just outside of Ephesus. Again, now it's turned over on its side, but you can sort of see just the shape of a cross in the way that the structure is organized. Let's go into the church. We're just going to note briefly very ornate architecture, 5th century. And now we go from there to Old St. Peter's in Rome, and we'll use this drawing to outline the different parts of the church. As you would walk in, you'd first find yourself in the atrium. That's actually considered part of the outside. You're not in the church yet, but you can gather there as you're prepared to go into the church. Next, as you move in, you come to the narthex. The word narthex just means the entrance, the way into the place. And it was here that the unbaptized, the people that were yet members, they could come and they could hear. They weren't going to be part of the inner circle, but they could come and they could hear the sermon, and they could hear about the gospel, and they could believe. Next, as we move into the church proper, we find ourselves in the nave. Now, the word nave, that's the place where the people would sit. It sounds a little bit like navy. And that's not by chance. It actually has the idea of a boat. Imagine people sitting in the boat. This is they're being rescued. Picture Noah and his family in the ark. This is the place for the saved to be. And then as I move further into the church, I find myself with the transept. This is the arms, the beam, the cross beam of the cross, if it's in the shape of a cross. And now in this case, there's also the bema or chancel. That means that there are steps leading up to it. The word bema is the raised platform on which a judge would sit. In fact, if you go to Greece today, bema is a Greek word. If you go to Greece today and go into their parliament building, the place of where the magistrate sits, that's called the bema. It's that raised platform. So here you have the bema, and then we move even further in to the altar itself. Now, did it start as an altar? Actually, when I read in the New Testament, I'm reading more about the idea of a table where they would come and sit at a table and eat the Lord's Supper. The term altar sort of bespeaks the idea that there is a sacrifice taking place, because that's what happens on an altar. A sacrifice is offered. And to be fair, Jesus already has been the sacrifice, but the idea of taking the bread and the wine is beginning to perhaps be seen, and later on, the church is going to adopt this. I don't know if they'd had this yet, but they're beginning to take this idea of the reminder of the one who died for us, who offered himself, and that's going to morph, and that's going to change into seeing the elements of the Eucharist as an unbloody sacrifice. Well, I'm not sure that we ought to say it that way, because the sacrifice was already made on the cross. But they're acting that out, and notice they're not really acting out his crucifixion. What they're acting out when they come to the table is they're partaking of the elements. In other words, that's what we do by faith. The sacrifice has already been made. The elements have been prepared, but now they have to be ingested, and that's what we do outwardly when we eat and drink, and it's what we do inwardly when we believe. One more element, as I get to the very top, notice I have what's called the cathedra. The word cathedra just means the seat. In fact, sometimes you'll hear about how this or that church leader spoke ex cathedra. He's speaking from the seat, from that place of authority. Here's the church of Polycarp in modern day Smyrna, what modern day Izmir. It used to be called Smyrna. Again, you can sort of see that framework of the cruciform church, with what nowadays, for that denomination, is an altar up front. And then I think we've already looked at a picture of the church of the church at Philippi. Here's just another shot of that. And then, for our last several, I want to take us to Jerusalem for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, this is a very old church. It looks old. As you come to it, it's hard to even at first note that it is in the cruciform form, but it does have that form. Here's a cross section of it. Again, with this one, you're not going to see the cruciform because you're not looking at overhead. But the church itself was constructed around the site that was believed back then, going all the way back to the 300s, and of course the death of Christ was in around 33 AD. So it was believed to have been built upon the place where they thought at the time, and they were probably right. They were a lot closer to it than we are. Where both Golgotha and also the place of burial were located. And what they've done, notice the red that you're seeing is the actual structure of the church. The striped yellow and orange is the ground around it that had to be cut away so that they could uncover this, and they did cut it away. I find it sort of unfortunate that they didn't leave it the way it looked from that very early period. That would have, I think, been nice. You go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's hard to envision Golgotha or the tomb, because it has become so very ornate. And so we look at you notice what they've done around the tomb. They've cut all the rock away and just made it into a chapel, into which you go, and it's always ringed and mobbed with people. However, if you go to the back end, past the chapel, through a door, there's an area there where there is, now I'm not saying this is the place where Jesus was, but there's an area where there is another tomb. And notice from the picture, you have to step down into the area. It's a little bit below ground, and you have to bend down because it's not meant for people to just go walking in, because it was constructed as a tomb. And when you go in, you can see the niches that were carved into the stone, into the rock, where they would place the various bodies. And this, I think, actually gives you a good representation of what a first century tomb looked like, because these are first century tombs. These are tombs from the time of when Jesus lived and died and was buried and rose again. Now, the last church we want to see is the Church of the Nativity. This is down in Bethlehem. Again, you can sort of see the cruciform form for the church. We're standing here in the nave. We're not sitting, and then you can go up to the front, and then actually down some stairs to the place where it was believed that Jesus was born. What's striking about this church, note here we're looking at the entrance of the church, and you can see the outline of the old entrance, but it has all been blocked off. The story goes back to in the Crusader days. The Crusaders had a nasty habit of the knights would ride their horses right into the church. And so to prevent that, they walled off the main door, and they constructed a second door in its place, but it's very low, so low that to get in, you have to bend over. Think about this. In order to approach the place where Jesus was born, in order to approach King Jesus, whether you're rich or poor or mighty or humble, no matter what your status, you must bow down. And it's a reminder that the one who was born here, if this is really the place he was born, that the one whose birth this church commemorates, that to him every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.